In this chapter, we will dive into the respiratory system. As we go through the respiratory system, I want you to focus on a number of questions. What is respiration? That's one. Two, what are the organs that make up the respiratory system? What are the functions of the respiratory system? How do the organ work? And finally, but not least, what are some issues associated to the respiratory system? Keep these questions in mind and try to find answers to these questions as you listen to this lecture. All right, so our first step is to define respiration. What is respiration? Well, respiration, it's a physiological process, a process in which oxygen comes in, carbon dioxide comes out. When I say comes in our lungs. Oxygen does, while carbon dioxide goes out. In the process, oxygen plays a very important role in acquisition of energy. All right? Oxygen is involved in what we call aerobic cellular respiration. Now, aerobic cellular respiration, it's a cellular process by which the cell obtains energy from the food we ingest. Okay? The byproduct of cellular respiration is going to be not only energy, water is going to be released, but also carbon dioxide is going to be released. That carbon dioxide is eventually what we are going to expel out of our lungs when we breathe out. Now, the respiratory system does not work alone. It works alongside with the circulatory system. As we breathe air in, oxygen is taken up, goes in the blood, and that oxygen that is now in the blood is going to be sent to different organs where cellular respiration needs to occur. As byproduct of the that cellular respiration, we're going to have release of carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide is going to be captured by the blood, transported, and in the lungs, carbon dioxide is going to be released as a gas, and we expel it when we do expiration. All right? So the respiratory system work alongside with the circulatory system to deliver oxygen to the tissues while removing carbon dioxide. The respiratory system is also essential in helping regulate the water-salt balance, acid-base balance in the body, which means that to some extent, it's going to be involved in also blood pressure, if you will. But that's a kind of a long shot for now. I'm not going to dive into that. Now, what are the different parts of the respiratory system? Basically, we are going to have two major divisions in the respiratory system. We're going to have the upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract. The upper respiratory tract is going to be composed of the nasal cavity, the pharynx, the glottis, and the larynx, while the lower respiratory tract is going to include the trachea, a windpipe, bronchi, bronchioles, the lungs, and the diaphragm. We are going to dive into each of the organs and their functions, even though on the slide you can see the functions of the different organs, but we're still going to talk about that a little later. Now, when we breathe air in, air goes through the nose, then it goes in the pharynx. From the pharynx, it goes in the larynx. Now, remember that the pharynx is relatively wide, right? We have the nasopharynx, the nasal cavity, nasopharynx. We have the oropharynx, oral cavity, right? And we have the laryngopharynx. So basically, you understand that from the nose, we go to the pharynx, to the larynx, then to the trachea or windpipe. And from the windpipe, we're going to have a division of the windpipe into bronchi, one bronchus, two bronchi. And the bronchi are going to divide further into bronchioles, and the bronchioles ultimately are going to develop into a sac that is called alveolus. Now, obviously, you don't have one of them, you have many sacs, many alveoli. We are going to take a look at that. Now, the upper respiratory tract, it is made up of the nose. We have the nasal cavity, right? I'm not going to bug you with the structural details, but the nasal cavity is going to be an area that is filled with mucus and hair and a lot of blood vessels. All of that, it's going to be very important for trapping some foreign particles, for moistening the air, and for warming the air up. We have the pharynx. The pharynx, actually, it's a large area with the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx right here. And then we are going to have the larynx. The larynx, it's right here, okay? It's also called the voice box, okay? We are going to address that a little later. Now, the nose is made up of nostrils or nares, okay? From the nostril and nares, you get to the nasal cavity, where you're going to have hair and mucus. Their job is to filter the air because there is a lot of particles in the air that many of them are infectious, right? So you want to stop them there. The nasal cavity has a bunch of capillaries, and the job of these capillaries is to make the air warm and moist. And then you have some specialized cells that are olfactory cells for scenting, okay? Olfactory receptors, odor receptors, it's the same thing, right? We have the tear glands that are actually draining in the nasal cavity. The pharynx, it's kind of like shaped like a funnel, right? It's a cavity that leads to a whole area that we call the throat, right? I did tell you that we have the nasopharynx, the laryngopharynx, and the oropharynx, okay? Please remember that. You have the tonsils that actually provide protection so that lower respiratory tract doesn't get infected by viruses and bacteria. Now, sometimes when we swallow, the food can go in the wrong area. Rather than going in the esophagus, the food can sometimes go in toward the windpipe, And when that happens, someone is going to choke. The person is going to choke. But how can we relieve that person who is in danger, right? So there is what we call the Heimlich maneuver. That maneuver is actually going to allow someone to save another person's life by basically acting right underneath of the rib cage, right underneath of the diaphragm, close the fist and use the second hand to actually wrap the fist just the way you see here and here, and basically push upward. You push upward, and by pushing upward forcefully, this is going to cause a contraction of the diaphragm, or force a contraction of the diaphragm, and eventually this is going to push some air from the lungs to the windpipe, which is going to put a pressure on the object so that the object flies out. Okay, so this is a life-saving, skill to learn. The larynx is where you are going to have the vocal cord. This vocal cord, actually you have the true vocal cord. These are the true vocal cords. And these ones here are the false vocal cord. Okay? You do have the epiglottis that actually moves when you swallow. It goes down to close the windpipe so that the food doesn't go by accident in the windpipe. Okay? And the glottis, it's basically the opening here, right, that you can see. To make a sound, the vocal cords are going to actually contract and relax. And by contracting and relaxing, you can make sounds. Going down, we have the trachea. The trachea, or windpipe, is lined with a type of epithelium that is columnar but pseudostratified. In chapter 4, I think, we saw the pseudostratified epithelium, right? It is columnar, but it is also ciliated. It has cilia. These cilia vibrate. They vibrate and push the mucus toward the throat, where the particles that are trapped are going to move progressively toward the throat, and eventually they're going to be swallowed. The particles are going to be swallowed, and they're going to be neutralized in the stomach. Notice a bunch of goblet cells. These goblet cells are responsible for producing the mucus, right? That mucus is actually going to trap all the particles that are in the air so that they don't get in the lower respiratory tract. Now, going down in the lower respiratory tract, the trachea is going to divide into bronchi. This is one bronchus. This is another bronchus, right? The bronchi are themselves going to branch off into secondary bronchi. The secondary bronchi are going to branch off into tertiary bronchi. And the tertiary bronchi are going to branch off into even smaller pipe that are called bronchioles. And the bronchioles are going to end up into forming some little sacs. This is one of them. This is another one of them. And the third one, right? These sacs are called alveoli. One alveolus, several alveoli, right? This alveoli, this is where exchange of gas is going to happen, right? So when we breathe in air, the air that is loaded, the oxygen that is abundant in the air, poor in the blood, is going to diffuse from the lung alveoli toward the blood vessels, specifically the capillaries. Okay? So as oxygen gets in the capillaries, carbon dioxide gets out of the capillaries and get in the lung alveoli to be exported outside of the cell. Now, the blood that comes in the lungs is poor in oxygen, rich in carbon dioxide, right? So that blood that comes in the lungs via pulmonary arterioles. Okay? Yeah, well, first of all, you have pulmonary arteries, right? Pulmonary arteries are going to divide into pulmonary arterioles. Okay? Now, there, in the capillary bed, exchange of gas is going to happen, right? Oxygen comes in. When oxygen comes in, it gets in the pulmonary venules. From the pulmonary venules, the oxygen-loaded blood is going to go in the pulmonary veins, and from the pulmonary veins, it gets in the left side of the heart. Okay? Now, again, carbon dioxide comes out, oxygen comes in. So here, we do see or show how exchange of gas is happening in the lungs, right? So we have oxygen coming from the air we breathe in that is going to diffuse. Oxygen diffuses across the layer of the alveolus, right? This is a simple squamous epithelium making up the alveolus, right? By the same token, the capillary is also made up of a simple squamous epithelium, all right? So that oxygen is going to diffuse easily, rather, from alveoli to the blood, so that this blood cells are now going to be loaded with oxygen, right? By the same token, the blood that is rich with carbon dioxide is going to see carbon dioxide diffusing from the blood vessel to the lung alveoli, so that carbon dioxide can be expelled out. Now, there is a structure, there is a chemical on the surface of the lung alveoli. That chemical is called surfactant. 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 That surfactant, it's a substance that forces open the alveoli. And whenever there is an inflammation of alveoli and you have loss of that surfactant, the alveoli collapse. That is a bad news. Now, the lungs are going to be organized into right and left lung. The right lung is going to have 3 lobes, while the left lung is going to be made up of 2 lobes. Okay? Now, remember that the heart is positioned in such way that it tilts toward the left side, right? It tilts toward the left side. And so there is a need of room for the heart. Therefore, in terms of structure, there is only 2 lobes in the left side of the lung, while in the right side you have 3 lobes. So each lung is going to have a membrane that wraps it. That membrane, it's a serous membrane. I'm not going to bug you with that, but it's a serous membrane called pleura. That's the name of the membrane. Okay? So, again, from the trachea, you're going to reach the bronchi. From the bronchi, you're going to have the bronchioles. From the bronchioles, you're going to have alveoli, right? Now, when the lungs fail, because of the technology today, it is possible to perform a lung transplant. And you know from the circulatory system that, no, not the circulatory system, actually the immune system, we say that there are some molecules that are called MHC, major histocompatibility complex. This major histocompatibility complex are going to determine the compatibility between a donor and a receiver, right? So when the MHC are closely related in terms of how similar they are, this is when we are going to say that 2 people are compatible, right? Nowadays, it is more and more possible to actually do lung transplant successfully. So you have here a patient who is who underwent lung transplant. Now, what is the mechanism of respiration? In respiration, we have 2 aspects, bringing air in and expelling air out. Bringing air in is called inspiration. Okay? Inspiration, it's an active process. An active process that consists of inhalating, and by inhalating, we are bringing air in. While expiration is going to be more of a passive kind of mechanism where actually you are kind of going from contraction to relaxation. Contraction takes energy, relaxation takes less energy, even though it takes energy, right? So expelling air out, it's easier than bringing air in, right? That's why inspiration is more of an active process, while expiration is more of a passive process. But how is all of this exactly happening? So basically, you have an example of a container here. That container is going to be inflated, okay? It's going to be inflated when the fluid moves in. When the fluid moves in, it's going to be inflated. Now, for that fluid to move in, the pressure inside of the chamber has to drop. And for that pressure to drop, the walls have to move outward. Okay? The walls have to move outward. Only when the walls move outward, this creates a depression inside of the system, so that in the opening here, there is going to be a need for air to come in. By the same token, when we compress the system, right, when we push the walls toward in, we are increasing the pressure inside of the system, which forces fluid or air out. Okay? So we have on top here inhalation or inspiration, here expiration or exhalation. Okay? Inspiration is going to be made possible because of the contraction of the diaphragm, okay, along with the contraction of the external intercostal muscles. Okay, by contracting, the external intercostal muscles are pulling the rib outwards, okay, which is going to cause a movement of the rib cage outward. That movement of the rib cage outward is going to actually cause a depression inside of the lungs. Drop of the pressure in the lungs is going to call for air inside the lungs, so that air is going to move in. Okay? However, when the pressure drops inside of when the pressure increases inside of the lungs, we're going to see the opposite. So basically, when the diaphragm relaxes, this is going to push the walls in. The intercostal muscles are going to bring the rib cage inward, right? That movement altogether is going to force an increase of pressure in, which is going to push air out. That's expiration or exhalation. Okay? Now, when we breathe in and out, we are dealing with a number of volumes of air. These volumes of air actually fall into different categories. The first one we want to mention is the tidal volume. At rest, you breathe in and breathe out without forcing anything. That is what we call the tidal volume. It's the small amount of air that is usually moved in and out with each breath that we take, right? Then the next aspect we are going to address is the vital capacity. The vital capacity is going to be the maximum volume of air that you can move in, plus the maximum of air that you can move out during a breathing cycle. So I take in air as much as possible and then push it out as much as possible. Right? That's basically is going to allow us to determine the vital capacity. But forcing air in and out is also a particular kind of volume that we are bringing. The inspiratory reserve volume, it's the forced volume that I'm bringing in when I'm breathing in forcefully, intentionally, right? And the expiratory reserve volume is the volume that I'm expelling out as much as possible and intentionally when I want to kick all the air out. But there is a point, in spite of the fact that I want to push air out, there is a certain amount of air that I can never expel out of my chest. Never. Because I don't have that much amount of work, right? So that regardless of how much we push air out, there is always some air in. That air that never goes anywhere, it's called residual volume. Okay? This is the air that remains in the lungs after you exhale as much as you can. Now, to visualize all of this, we have the tidal volume here. That tidal volume is the volume you breathe in and out at a normal level without forcing anything. And then you have an inspiratory reserve volume. That inspiratory reserve volume, this is when you force air in as much as possible. And expiratory reserve volume, that's the air you can push out as much as possible until you cannot anymore. Okay? So these three volumes, the inspiratory reserve volume, the tidal volume, and the expiratory reserve volume, is what we call the vital capacity. However, on top of that, when we add the volume of air that we can never kick out because we don't have enough strength, that volume, the residual volume, to the vital capacity altogether constitute the total lung capacity. Actually, we never really get to use the total lung capacity. So now that we talked about inspiration and expiration, the question we need to ask now is, how is my respiration controlled? The respiration is controlled in the brain. There is a respiratory center. That respiratory center actually controls the breathing in and breathing out, right? There is a part of the brain that is called the medulla oblongata that is located here. The medulla oblongata that sends impulses. These impulses are going to cause a contraction of the intercostal muscles and the intercostal muscles, yes. And in the intercostal muscles, you have the internal and the external intercostal muscles. Okay? Now, there is a nerve, the phrenic nerve, that stimulates the contraction of the diaphragm. Now, sometimes this phrenic nerve can actually send impulses out of control. This is when the diaphragm actually contracts without really you controlling it. That's the hiccup, right? When the phrenic nerve actually sends impulse to the diaphragm so that the diaphragm contracts without really needing to contract. Now, it has been shown now that the sudden infant death is associated with a dysfunctioning respiratory center, right? When the respiratory center stops sending signal. so that the intercostal muscles are not responding properly anymore, right? This can cause uh, a child to die. Now, we have the nervous control of breathing, but you also have the chemical control of breathing. That chemical control of breathing actually follows some chemoreceptors, and those chemoreceptors are sensitive to pH change, right? We have two sets of chemoreceptors that are going to sense a drop in the pH, okay? And that drop in the pH is going to cause us to actually increase our breathing, right? Now, carbon dioxide plays a very important role in controlling the pH. A lot of carbon dioxide in our system causes the pH to go down, right? Causes the pH to go down. And as the pH goes down, we need to bring that pH back up, right? By breathing more often. And by breathing more often, we are actually kicking carbon dioxide out. And let me tell you this, that oftentimes when you are inactive, you're having a shallow breath, the pH tends to go down. You have an accumulation of carbon dioxide, and this excess carbon dioxide oftentimes is kicked out by a reflex. That reflex is the reflex of yawning, right? When we yawn, we are actually pushing a bunch of carbon dioxide out. And you notice that when you are tired, you yawn a lot. And the reason why you yawn a lot, it's because you have a shallow breath. And that shallow breath, that shallow breathing, it's basically causing an accumulation of carbon dioxide in your system and therefore a drop in the pH. But let me close that parenthesis. You do have chemoreceptors, right, that sense a drop in the pH. Now, oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged in two levels in your system. You have in the lungs and in the tissues. Okay? Oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged in the lungs and in the tissues. But how is this exchange of gas happening? Well, you want to know that it happens by simple diffusion, right? It happens by simple diffusion. And you know, for simple diffusion, the concentration of chemicals across the membrane is very important. The chemicals are going to move from area where the concentration is high toward an area where the concentration is low, right? Now, we are not going to talk about concentration of carbon dioxide and concentration of oxygen, but we are going to use another term that is the partial pressure. Okay? The partial pressure, which is the pressure exerted by a chemical, in this case, carbon dioxide and oxygen. The question we are going to ask at all time is this: where is the partial pressure the highest for a given chemical? For oxygen, for carbon dioxide, right? Wherever the partial pressure is the highest, it's where the chemical is going to diffuse from, okay, toward where the partial pressure is lower, okay? All right, so oxygen and carbon dioxide will diffuse from an area of higher concentration toward an area of lower concentration or lower partial pressure. Okay? So now, in the lungs, what happens? Well, the blood loaded with carbon dioxide that comes from the tissues, right, goes in the lungs. That blood is rich with carbon dioxide. Therefore, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is high in the blood that is in the lungs compared to the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the lung alveoli. Because of that, carbon dioxide is going to leave the blood in the lungs and go in the lung alveoli so that carbon dioxide is expelled out. Okay? This is what you show here. Right? Okay? So carbon dioxide comes from the red blood cells to the lung alveoli. Okay? The partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood at the lung level is higher than in the lung alveoli. However, for the oxygen is completely the opposite. The blood that is in the lungs, the blood that is in the lungs is poor in oxygen, but the air that is in the alveoli is rich with oxygen compared to the blood, obviously, right? So that oxygen is going to diffuse from the lung alveoli toward the blood cells, okay? There, oxygen is going to attach to hemoglobin, and hemoglobin will now be loaded with oxygen. We call this oxyhemoglobin, and now the blood is going to be bright red. Okay? So this is how exchange of gas is happening at the lungs level. How about the tissues? In the tissues, it's going to be the opposite. What do we mean? We mean that the blood here in the blood vessel is loaded with oxygen, while the cells in the tissues is poor with oxygen. So oxygen is going to diffuse from the blood toward the cells. By the same token, the cells that have done cellular respiration are loaded with carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide is more concentrated in the cell than it is in the blood, so that carbon dioxide is going to go from the cells toward the blood. And this is how the blood is going to be loaded with carbon dioxide, right? Now, when oxygen attaches to hemoglobin, it forms a complex that we call oxyhemoglobin. Okay, oxyhemoglobin. However, when carbon dioxide attaches to hemoglobin, because yes, carbon dioxide does attach to hemoglobin. When that happens, we call the complex carbaminohemoglobin. So now, in the external respiration, which is actually in the lungs, right? Hydrogen attaches to bicarbonate to form carbonic acid. Carbonic acid is going to split into water and carbon dioxide, so that carbon dioxide is going to diffuse out. The oxyhemoglobin, right? So that's hemoglobin without oxygen, is going to accept oxygen to become oxyhemoglobin. That is in the lungs, right? In the lung area. Now, in the tissues, it's going to be the opposite. Oxyhemoglobin is going to dissociate into the oxyhemoglobin and oxygen, while Carbon dioxide is going to combine with water to form carbonic acid. That carbonic acid is going to split because this chemical can hurt our cells. So carbonic acid is going to split into hydrogen ion and bicarbonate. Okay, that bicarbonate is the most abundant form of carbon dioxide in the blood. But let me close that parenthesis. Now, there are some issues that can occur with our respiratory system, whether it is the upper respiratory tract or the lower respiratory tract. Let's start with the upper respiratory tract. In the upper respiratory tract, we can have sinusitis. This is when the sinuses are blocked, okay, or inflamed. We can have otitis media. This is an infection of the middle ear. Tonsillitis, it's an inflammation of tonsils. And laryngitis, it's an infection of the larynx, right? That can lead to the loss of your voice. Now, going in the lower respiratory tract, we have some condition including pneumonia, which is an infection of the lungs that produces a thick fluid, and that thick fluid actually fills up the lung alveoli and decreases the surface of exchange, which is a bad news and which can cause death. Actually, when someone has a bad pneumonia. Tuberculosis, it's a bacterial infection. That bacterial infection is going to actually cause the formation of tubercles. These tubercles are going to cause the lungs to fall apart. And eventually, by the lung falling apart, this causes the person to actually not be able to exchange gas properly and eventually die. Pulmonary fibrosis. This is when some connective tissue fibers are going to develop in the lungs, causing the lungs to become stiff. And when the lungs become stiff, you don't have as much air that can comes in as needed or go out as needed, which is a problem. Emphysema, it's a chronic condition that is incurable. This is when alveoli are damaged, so that you have a decrease of the overall surface of exchange because of simply the alveoli breaking down. You have big holes in the lungs that basically reduces the possibility of exchange of gas. Then we have asthma. Asthma is when we have a constriction of airways, right? And we have an irritation of the airways, and the air has a hard time getting through the airways. And then we have situations of lung cancer. This is when cells of the lungs undergo uncontrolled cell division, which is actually a bad news. So here we have the case of pneumonia, where we have alveoli that are filled with fluid, right? Which decreases the surface of exchange. Fibrosis stiffens the walls of the lungs. Tuberculosis create tubercles in the lungs, which causes lungs to fall apart. Emphysema, which actually cause the lung alveoli to burst like this, okay? And this decreases the surface of exchange. Asthma, the airways are constricted, okay? And there is no proper exchange. We have bronchitis, when we have some mucus, thick mucus on the walls, which can block the air coming in or out. Now, let's address some other topics that are rather maybe controversial, maybe not controversial. E-cigarette. Is e-cigarette safe? You've heard a lot about e-cigarette. Bottom line, e-cigarette is not safe. Okay? So e-cigarette were actually presented as an alternative way of getting off tobacco. But today, we know that e-cigarette is not safe. Now here, we have a patient with lung cancer. This is a normal lung, and this is a lung with cancer. Now see how this lung is dark, right? With all the nicotine that were taken in over time. And again, whether you are using e-cigarette or you are using normal cigarette, the outcome is almost the same, right? Here we have a mass of cell, which is a tumor, right? Bad news, so not really good. So what should we know about tobacco and health? Now, first and foremost, all forms of tobacco are damaging to your health, regardless of how this is put. It is harmful, right? Smoking is going to increase the chance of lung cancer, mouth cancer, larynx cancer, esophagus, bladder, kidney, pancreas, stomach, cervix. All these cancers can be caused by smoking, right? We have a decrease in life expectancy when we smoke, right? Smoking also increases chances of chronic bronchitis. And this is possible because as we smoke, the cilia of the windpipe are destroyed. And it takes time to gain those cilia back if we can gain them back at all, right? Passive smoking is not as harmful. I don't want to say as harmful as active smoking, but passive smoking is also an issue. And what we mean by passive smoking, it's for instance, mom or dad smoking in the house where a child is there. The child is not smoking, but the child is breathing the air that mom or dad or uncle or whoever is smoking is doing, which puts the passive smoker at risk for diseases that are triggered by nicotine. Finally, let's discuss some ethical questions. Now, some questions that we can actually start thinking about or brainstorming about. Is it ethical to ban smoking? Yes, smoking is bad, but is it a good thing to ban smoking? Now, if we say, okay, yes, let's ban smoking, but wait a minute, are we not infringing on the freedom of whoever decide that I want to smoke? That is my lifestyle, right? You cannot tell me to live the life the way you want me to live it. So my life is my life. So I make a decision to smoke, right? But there is a discussion over a non-smoker infringing on smokers' freedom, and are smokers infringing on non-smokers' freedom, right? So it's really, you know, it's a it's an ethical question that is worth a discussion. Then eventually we're going to argue all day long, and then we're going to say, okay, well, let's take a decision. But who is making the decision, right? We have to create laws, right? Question now, will the legislation help smokers quit? That's a question that is valid. Should smoking be banned in public areas, including bars and casinos? And a question that is not a neglectable question, it's do smoking, actually, is the ban of smoking going to hurt the economy? When you consider companies like Marlboro employ multiple families, I mean, thousands and thousands of people, right? So if we say, okay, well, let's ban smoking, so that means that we have to shut down Marlboro. Now, these guys have been exploiting tobacco for I don't know how long. Now, you imagine that many people are going to be unhappy whether they smoke or not, right? The idea that they're going to lose their job, and the idea that the government is going to lose some taxpayers, right, raises a bunch of questions. So you have a number of questions that are not easy questions, but these are questions that are worth asking, right? So let's stop our conversation here. Thanks for your attention.